You are now listening to the Come to the Table podcast with your host, Sean McCoy, where each week he invites a guest and welcomes them to the table to discuss any and all topics. First and foremost, Christians are called to love all people, and one of the best ways to love them is to sit down, talk with them, and listen to what they have to say. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey.
All right, welcome to episode 1. The true first episode of the Come to the Table podcast. I'm your host, Sean McCoy, and it is my honor to be here with you today. And we're going to dive right into this. As many of you may have heard from our first episode, our purpose, our goal behind all of this is to extend an invitation to come to the table to talk about issues and topics of just about any kind, and especially those topics that are difficult. These difficult topics that tend to dominate, separate, and divide. And all we seem to do, or at least that's the impression, is just have outside rhetoric coming at each other, and there's really not a chance for us to come together and talk about it. And there doesn't really seem to be any opportunity to heal or truly make progress, as I think that is inherent in most of us. And one of those subjects that I think is obviously very polarizing, and obviously one that everybody has a say on and everybody is aware of, is around race and racism in our country. And how it's part of our history. It is part of our day to day. We hear about it. I can tell you as a kid, it was one of the first things I ever remember hearing about, literally on the news or seeing, and having an emotional reaction towards, and wanting to know why people were being treated in such a way based on something as simple as their skin. As a naive child, saying to my parents and asking them, "What is this all about?" And to be fair, based on our society, regardless of my own personal beliefs, how the world sees me is I am a 44-year-old white guy as far as the world sees it and what you would say if you saw me. So that's the world that I'm coming from. But to be fair, and in the spirit of what we're trying to do, you have to have a conversation with people, especially people that come from a different perspective of yours, if for no other reason than to give them the opportunity to tell you their side of that story. Their experiences aren't the same as mine, them being anyone else. I only know what I know. But for us to turn around and have an opportunity to speak, and to that, there's a friend of mine, somebody that when I first started thinking about this, one of the first gentlemen that came to my mind, somebody that I know, somebody that I go to church with, somebody that I haven't known for a very, very long time, but what I have known from him in a short period is he's somebody that I truly respect. He's my friend James Saunders, Jim, as I like to call him. And he and I reached out to him when we first came up with this idea of this podcast, and I asked him if he wanted to be a part of this. And we had a handful of conversations on the phone, all of which around this subject and around other subjects. And I just found myself really wanting him to be the first guy to come on here and be the first thing that you guys hear about, and dive kind of deep into a subject and show you first and foremost right out the gate that we can sit down and have a conversation around a hot topic, around a topic that creates emotion, around a topic that has recently cost people their lives, and that people have been, and we've seen violence and people in the streets fighting in this country, throwing things at each other, running people over, and having all of this anger and vitriol around certain things associated with race. And so I think more than as much as any other subject, this is something we need to start having a conversation around, a constructive conversation, a respectful conversation. And to that, I'm going to invite my friend Jim to come on this show and talk about it and let him set the tone. All I told him was I wanted to have a conversation around race. And I said I kind of wanted him to tell me what he felt was on his heart to talk about in regards to that, because there are so many elements to that we could go into. But what is it that he wants to talk about? What is it that he wants you to know and hear from him so that we can have a conversation around that? And can I challenge myself to be fair? If I'm going to be fair to you and to everybody and to Jim, where do I stand in all this? Do I have struggles that I'm not sure of? Where's the plank in my eye? And if I have that, let it be challenged and let it be exposed. It's not meant to point fingers. It's not meant to blame for the sake of it. But are there things that we could do better? Are there things that we can look at and say, I need to change my viewpoint on this? I need to have a better way of looking at this. I need to come with this from a loving heart and understand first and vice versa. We can't expect others to love us and to be open to us unless we're willing to at least let them listen to the table. Come to the table and listen to what they have to say. All right. I'll stop and I'll get off my little pedestal and my little soapbox. And so to that, give me just a moment. I'm going to run out, get a hold of Jim, and I'll be right back. All right, guys and gals, we're back. Jim, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course, my friend. Of course, I'm excited and
Me too.
and as we get started, there's so many different ways we could jump into this.
Yeah.
And the way that I want to start doing this, whenever we have guests on, as a bit of an homage and as a bit of a tribute to one of my favorite podcasts. This is a free plug. They don't know me. There's going to be people who are going to be tired of hearing me say this, but I'll go ahead and tell you, if you're looking for something else to listen to, if you like podcasts, Team Never Quit is a podcast hosted by David Rutherford and Marcus Luttrell, two Navy SEALs. I was in the Navy. I respect those gentlemen for what they're doing. And I respect their podcast for what they're doing and being an inspiration. And so this is a free plug for them. And one of the things they do to get us started, Jim, is they do what they call a Mad Minute. It has nothing to do with this subject. It's just a way to kind of get us going. You know, we're sitting here, we're sitting at a table, and we're having a conversation. But instead of just trying to dive in, and also I want to give you a chance to kind of get to know Jim. Some things about him that give you some perspective. And so to that, we'd like to do a deep dive. Are you willing to take the deep dive?
I'm willing to take a deep dive. Let's do it.
All right, buddy. So here, first question. You're stuck on an island, and somehow, miraculously, you have a radio or you have a stereo that can play music, and it can bring any music you want into it, but only one type of music, and it's the only type of music you can ever listen to again.
One genre.
One genre. What would it be?
I'd have to say 70s disco.
70s disco.
I'm thinking Bee Gees and Night Fever.
Night Fever.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right. Okay, so right out of the bag, right? So never would have guessed that, my friend. I would not have guessed that, because that's, so here we go. All right, 70s disco. I love that. I love that answer.
Staying alive. I mean, come on, I'm on an island. I gotta stay alive, right?
Very apropos. Very nice. Love it. Awesome. Okay, so next question. What's the last book that you read that made a huge or lasting impression on you?
Ooh. The last book I read was Kennedy and King: The Battle Over Civil Rights.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Great book. It gave some background from both leaders, from Robert Kennedy John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, as well as Martin Luther King Jr., and the relationship that they built. They would come from two different aspects in America. One saw America through a different lens, through a lens of oppression, through a lens of being denied of basic human rights and civil rights. The other lens was a lens that was foreign to the strife and struggles that Americans were going through, that were living here just like everyone else, and how their opposite worlds actually came together. They collided a little bit first. They ran parallel a little bit first, but then they blended together.
So what was if you can, what was some of the things, or what was one thing from each of those sides that you learned relative to one of the Kennedys or both, and Dr. King, that you would say stuck out, that you didn't know, or kind of went, well, I didn't know that about them, or an impression real quick about either one of those that stood out to you from that book?
What stood out to me in the book from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s side was the amount of stress and patience that he endured within the African American community,
mm-hmm.
as well as externally from the rest of the country. And from the Kennedy's side of the family, from what I learned from that was, what I observed was just the amount of influence that Robert Kennedy Jr. Robert Kennedy had in the ongoings and with the
With his brother's administration.
Yeah, right. With his brother's administration. I was like, wow, I didn't know that much about Robert until I read this book, and he was really influential as well. Did a tremendous amount of work in civil rights.
And it was called Kennedy and King?
Yeah, the Battle of Civil Rights.
Okay. Little reading material out there if you guys want to catch that. And second to well, there's actually a couple more. What's the best advice you've ever received? Who gave it to you, when, and why?
It had to come from one of my former managers as well as a director. She said to me, find your race, know your race, and run it. And I think that's been some career advice that stuck with me up until this day. Being able to find your lane, find what you're passionate about, knowing everything that you can about it to become a subject matter expert, and then running that race and not worrying about whatever the race everybody else is running.
Nice. Okay. And then the last one before we get to our two standards that we're going to ask everybody going forward, but if there was a statistic from your life that you could ask God and know, or ask whomever and know, what would this statistic be that you'd want to know about yourself?
When was the last time that I actually laughed really hard? I mean, laughed where I couldn't catch my breath. Tears were coming out of my face. My face was coming out of my eyes. My face was turning red. That type of laugh. I feel as if I haven't laughed that hard in a long time. And I'm not sure if it's because I don't have a sense of humor anymore. I like to think that I do. People say things are hilarious, and I'm like, are they hilarious, or are they just really funny? Because you hear all the time that something is hilarious. They just go for the top shelf word as being like hysterical. I'm like, is it hysterical, or is it just really, or is it funny? So I want to find that moment where I was really laughing and call that hysterical or hilarious, and then try to find that in present day.
Did you ever watch that show Wipeout?
I've seen it before, but I didn't regularly watch it.
Did that ever make you laugh, like just hysterically as those people?
No.
Oh, see, my kid, I would start crying at watching somebody just oblivious to what's kind of knowing what's coming because of the show, but here they go, and they're just trying to run, and then this big old foam boxing glove just comes flying out and just clocks them, right, and just knocks them, and this doesn't really hurt them. So maybe I don't know. Maybe there's a maturity level there that you have that I don't. That I just think is just. But there's also comedians I think that are
right.
I think Bill Burr is pretty funny. You go look at some of the stuff that he does. I've seen him in concert. He's pretty funny. There's some unbelievable comedians out there I think today that just for me make me just. Cry hysterically because I think without this we may be getting off on a tangent already, but. Comedians seem to be...
They have the hardest jobs.
But they also seem to have this uncanny ability to point out the fallacies of everything. Like they're so good. Like they're the last kind of smart observers going, are you for real with X, Y, Z? And they can kind of show it and portray it in such a way that's not where you're degrading the thing or anything that's overly negative, but you're kind of poking fun at it like really this is what you're doing. So I love comedians. Robin Williams was one of my favorite of all time, and
who's really refreshing. It's really refreshing to see, and you made me think of him when you mentioned Robin Williams, was Steve Martin. He's still relevant. Joe Piscopo, the old crew from Saturday Night Live, sure. And the careers that they went on to have, they still had some real good material, and they were creative with it. And I think that's kind of what's missing with the outlets today is the creativity that's involved.
Did you ever watch Chappelle Show? Were you a big Chappelle Show fan?
See, that's probably part of the statistic. The Chappelle Show was hilarious. Kings of Comedy. That when I saw them, the Kings of Comedy, Steve Harvey, Bernie Mac, D.L. Hughley, and those guys in person.
Because you said
it was hilarious. Now that was hilarious.
Right. You said creative, and my first thought was, there's comedians that get up and do a bit. Right. But Chappelle created literally a show.
He created a movement.
Like this whole thing around, all the. And he was this. I think something that we can all just kind of laugh at. But he also took subjects like this, that are around difficult things sometimes to talk about, and managed to put it out there in such a way that called people kind of the carpet, like, hey, here it is. And he didn't really apologize for it. And then I think about Chris Rock in that same vein as far as his comedy, and I always think he's hilarious. But okay, great. And then last two. One is, what is your spiritual belief, your personal belief or faith for you, Jim?
I'm a Christian, and I say that without any hesitation. I think being a Christian is the most wonderful gift that anyone could receive, because regardless of what day I'm having, regardless of the actions or missteps that I take, I know that I'm not taking them alone. And it's just a relief to know that I have a moral compass that is never going to fail. It's never going to, send me in the wrong direction. And at the end of the day, I can rest my head at night with the firm belief that I know that I'm going to be able to, get through wherever I need to get through and have victories.
So to that, just to give a little context, and we'll try not to go down this road too far, or because it could become a whole show, I'm sure. But would your journey spiritually, have you always been a believer? Did it come and go? Would you have kind of as brief as you can be, in a sense, kind of a 101 on your faith story?
My faith has never faltered. It's never swayed. It's gotten low at times, just because of the amount of troubles or challenges that I might have been facing. But we're human. We're not going to be able to overcome obstacles, the things that life throws at us, and that's pretty much stated in the Bible. But the beauty behind it is that we're not facing those alone, and we're able to overcome those things through faith, through our faith, and through hope, and through trust.
All right. So last question. In your personal experience around people of other religions, and I wanted to ask you specifically about Muslims and Islam, what has been your general impression and general experience around either or both Muslims, or just your impression of Islam in general as a religion?
I feel as if Islam is similar to Christianity, and it would be wonderful if we could have, if there could be a blending of the two ideologies. They believe in God, but they don't believe as Jesus being the Son of God. They believe Jesus being actually as a messenger or a prophet.
Third prophet, yeah.
And that's it. And that is the one thing that I'm like, wow, I wish we could, I wish you guys, or I wish, there could be a better understanding, but between the two. That I don't want to say that that's not the case, but from my Christian standpoint, it is the case. There's some things that I do admire with the fact, and one of them is that they're able to have one version of the Bible. To be honest with you, they have the Quran, and
right.
It's written one way, and that's it. And in Christianity, there's a lot of different versions of the Bible, and to me, it gets a little bit. The message seems to waver a little bit.
Oh yeah, if you have the Bible app, like I'm sure you do, and as I do, you can. There's lots of versions. You can go all kinds of different directions.
Right.
All right, so great. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. Hopefully, that gives you some insight into Jim a bit, and kind of helps get us a little bit ready for what's coming. And so to that, as I mentioned before in the intro, I really wanted to sit down with Jim and talk about race and talk about something along those lines. And so I really kind of want to defer conversation to you, kind of what's on your heart. If you want to give a little background about your personal story or who you are in that context, without trying to state the obvious, but trying to give you a little bit of an opportunity to set the table for who you are. And then let us, what would you like to talk about, my friend?
Well, let me first start by saying that the thoughts and views of myself aren't reflective of the round table here, but nor do they reflect all African Americans. But they're just my experience. I just wanted to, put that out there and give a little context as to what my experience has been in present times and how I've viewed growing up as an African American. And I say African American because that is how I identify. Of course, we use the casual terms of black, white, yellow, brown, things along that line for convenience. But I think there's also a need to, for the ethnicities to be identified because it's a place of respect. It's a place of acknowledgement, and for many cultures, it's a way to have pride in who they are.
So you said, okay, so would you consider it more of you said ethnic and you said culture.
Mm-hmm.
So would you think it's more of an extension of those things as much as it is race in general, or could you just elaborate a little bit on that in terms of where you come down on that, or where you came to that conclusion as you mentioned it?
Well, for example, if you fill out an application for employment, you'll see the different designations to identify who you are. You'll see Latino American, you'll see Asian American, you'll see white, and then you'll see black. Why does that exist? Why is there? And I think that list has actually grown over the years, because there used to be 4 boxes. Now there's probably 9, 9 plus.
Asian American, there could be, I think, Hispanic, not Hispanic, stuff like that. I recall
Hispanic, but not black, or not African, or things along that line. But it's just a personal preference that sure. I, care to identify with.
And I definitely appreciate you saying that in the beginning, because I do want to emphasize that to the listeners that the point of this, Jim is just one person. It's about his experience. It's about where he comes from, because we can really kind of only have one conversation at once. And it's not necessarily fair that you, quote unquote, represent all of X, whatever X may be. But at the same time, and you and I discussed this earlier before we started, and you'll hear me say this again, and this is one of the things I hope we keep in retrospect when we're having these conversations, is that when you do see somebody do something, whatever that person may be, does get lopped into things demographically. If you see somebody who's a bad driver and they fit a certain demographic, you're probably saying, see, it's just reinforcing what I think about X type of driver. And we both, Jim and I, are in Houston, and you can already guess which kind of driver we're talking about here. But so that becomes part of that, that grouping or whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't mean that every one that's of that demographic is a bad driver.
Absolutely.
It just becomes part of that. And that I think is really kind of at the core of a lot of what we're talking about. So I definitely appreciate you putting that in context. And so along those lines, if you want to give a little bit more kind of about your personal history, a little bit where you're coming from, and then we can kind of jump in.
Well, I want to start with a quote from 2 people, because I mentioned them earlier. One from John Kennedy, and he said that it is America's tradition to stand up for one's rights. Even if that means the only way to stand up for one's rights is to sit down. And the second one is from Dr. King. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of peace. The tension we see today is tension that comes when oppressed people rise up and move towards a permanent positive peace. Those 2 quotes were from the 60s and around a tumultuous time in our nation's history over civil rights. And I think that it's just interesting how what they said then can easily be applied to what we're seeing today in our nation, in our country. So if you think about the 2 topics that could be applied to those quotes, one issue that comes up is over the protest for standing up, the Colin Kaepernick protest, standing up versus kneeling during the national anthem. There's a lot of conversations in regards to that, and I think that people are taking what was viewed as a symbol to raise the awareness of the injustices that have been happening across our country when it comes to race relations and enforcing in police enforcement, police brutality and things along that line. That is a conversation that a lot of people are trying to have, but it's not happening in the way that it needs to, because there's a lot of emotions involved with it, and there's a lot of misunderstanding in regards to what Colin Kaepernick's intentions are with it.
So I think this is a beautiful point. I think we can definitely do this right now. So let's be fair. So you saw what goes through your mind, what went through your head, and how did you personally see what he did and what it actually meant and why he did it? This isn't about, and it's not even really, and I think this is fair, it's not even a right or wrong thing. It's just what did you see, and what did you see what he was doing and why he was doing it? And if you could if you could tell somebody, even myself or other people, regardless of, because I'm not trying to say that I'm taking a stance either way, but I'm just saying the other side, proverbially speaking, what do you think they should know, and what did you see when you saw him do that?
I would like for the person to know that Colin Kaepernick's actions weren't meant to disrespect the veterans that the flag represents. The flag also represents the Americans that have fought for the flag and that have been protected by the flag, and that includes people of color. The American Revolution started with one gunshot, and that was by Crispus Attucks.
Boston Massacre, yeah.
The Boston Massacre. What was Crispus Attucks doing? He was defending the rights of a child that was struck by a gun butt from one of the British soldiers. Our patriotism started as early as 1776. You take that and you go throughout history, World War I, World War II, Vietnam. There's always been representation of people of color fighting for our country. So our patriotism shouldn't be the question, and that wasn't the reason why Colin Kaepernick took a stance during the national anthem. He took a stance to raise the awareness of the injustices that have been happening as African Americans and people of color have been victims of police brutality. It's gotten to the point where we're being oppressed by the people, or the system that's supposed to protect and serve, at alarming rates. So I applauded Colin Kaepernick, and I still do. And the questions of, well, it was, he shouldn't do it, during the national anthem. He could do it after he gets off work. He can do it in the off season. Protest is supposed to make people feel uncomfortable. There's no right time to boycott. There's no right time to have to do a sit-in or to do a march. When it comes to making a statement, making a point, I think he's been doing that, and unfortunately, it's been washed over by people viewing him as being unpatriotic, and then it just goes off into this question of he's not being, he's disrespecting the flag, and that's just never been the case.
So there's been, obviously this was not the first time, and not the first time around this issue, or issues related to this. I remember Chris Jackson, LSU basketball player, he changed his name to Sharif
Abdul-Rahim.
And I remember him, this is way back, I think in the 80s and even the 90s, when he wasn't standing for the national anthem. I think about the was it the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City,
right?
And so it seems, so help me, so paint me a little bit of a picture around, because a lot of people were saying stuff like, well, Colin Kaepernick, you made all this money and you're successful, and you're this athlete who gets to live this lifestyle, while soldiers and law enforcement officers are putting their lives on the line so that you can do this. You should stand up for them because they
stand up for who, the law enforcement,
or just right in general. So that's kind of some of the argument on the other side. But where do you think this kind of I don't want to say the sports conflict? And I only started thinking about this because of the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. That is there a sense of frustration that yes, we can, and I say we because I have a question about that later in terms of that. But for lack of a better, for the sake of argument, African American athletes can go out and can become successful and can play basketball and can play baseball and can run track, but not have the same representation, and should just literally, they can come out here and do that, but they're not allowed to have an opinion on anything. And I think
absolutely, it's a form of control where we're good enough to run the ball for you, put it in the hoop. We're good enough to play sports, but that's all that we want you to do. We don't want you to have a say-so. We don't want you to have a voice. We don't want you to think. All we want you to do is win championships for us and bring us money. That's all we want you to do. And once you stop doing that, then we have a problem.
So it makes me think of, I'm trying to think how I can put this.
If we think about some of the statements that President Trump said, if we think of in regards to the NFL athletes, if we think about what the manager of the Texans said about, after a while we'll have the inmates running the prison.
It was the owner, yeah, Bob McNair.
Oh,
right.
I'm sorry, the owner.
That's okay. Right, he didn't want the prisoners running or the inmates running the prison. Right. So I guess in lieu of those things,
and then on top of that, LeBron James making millions of dollars. One would think that he would be detached from any type of discrimination or racial outbursts. His home gets vandalized with a racial expletive across the front of his gate. So even someone of his stature cannot escape the hatred that exists, in regards to racial lines.
So to that, and you mentioned earlier that we were kind of chewing the same dirt, or the impression of the quotes was the same kind of today as it was 50 years ago. What about the comments or words that are said around the idea that there has been progress, or that there has been improvement, or that there are, while there are people that say and do those things and have those impressions, that there's a lot of people who don't? I mean, is there, where can we, to be fair, find the common ground? Because I can say from a personal standpoint, not a fan of any of those things in terms of the context, or in terms of having somebody write that on LeBron James's front gate. I just don't think there's any place for that ever. But they happen, and so what do we do, right? Or what can we do? What is the idea, or what can people know to help? I don't want to say desensitize or keep them from doing, or what do we do? What do we kind of do around those things?
I think one of the main issues that exists is that we don't acknowledge the differences in our culture, in our families, in our skills and our abilities of other people. It's just taboo. It's not explored in mainstream, and it's not explored in academia. There's one way to look at things, which is the mainstream way. People would say, well, why is there a black entertainment television network? Because all the other networks are mainstream. They're not all inclusive, and do not reflect the families that watch the TV shows, or it's not an accurate depiction of what America looks like. So outlets like Black Entertainment Television or Telemundo, they broadcast the same themes of mainstream, but from our perspective.
And is that, is that important to have that context? And then, so to be fair, obviously I'm not, I guess, qualified to be in that culture per se, right?
Yeah, you are.
Well, but I mean, it's not, to your point, if you're looking to relate, right? I'm not going to be able to relate in that context, right?
You could if you tried.
Okay.
You might surprise yourself.
Okay. But in terms of target audience, right? You're not looking for the McCoy family to watch a show on Black Entertainment Television, right? Ideally, at least initially, right? But I guess maybe you're kind of helping get to my point. Is there either one, a desire to do that, and two, so how do we, if the idea is to separate and to create opportunities for over here, and then, but in either it has to represent us, and if it doesn't,
the opportunity is to integrate, not separate.
Okay. So what would you say about the argument if somebody says, well, by creating Black Entertainment Television, you are creating separation? Is that you see what I'm saying? So how do we honor, in a sense, the need to kind of, I don't want to say, or honor a culture or an idea or a different kind of viewpoint, to your point of we don't feel represented, the collective we over here, so we create our own, whether it's, magazine, subculture, to be fair, music, however you want to look at it.
So the HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, they were established outside of mainstream because there's no reason to say I'm going to a white university because the university is already the majority white.
Gotcha.
It's just, it's a title, but that's it.
Have you been watching This Is Us? Have you watched that show?
I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it.
So it's currently one of our favorite shows. It's probably our favorite show right now.
Oh, and I'm sorry, one more thing.
Go ahead.
About the HBCUs. Quite a few of them have admissions of about 40% of Caucasians, which is pretty interesting to know. So literally 40%
of the student body is
in some university. Yeah, absolutely. Lincoln University, I believe, Savannah State have quite a representation of Caucasians.
So is there anything so what's happening there that makes that possible? Are you aware of what makes that an open environment enough that people kind of literally almost on both sides, for lack of a better phrase, are going to college under this premise of a HBCU that is now really, has a pretty good chunk of people that are not. Is that an initiative? I'd be curious what that is.
So would I.
So I guess because what I'm ultimately getting at is to that. To me, that's where I see us wanting to get towards is that harmony, is that homogeneous aspect. And so how do we overcome these things that you mentioned earlier and these comments and these impressions and to be fair, I think continued, if I'm on the other side, and that's the thing too, is I even kind of hate this argument to be fair, that how do I would have a tough time feeling included if I was excluded. And that's really, I think I would imagine, and you mentioned it earlier a little bit, that is really the catch. You don't feel part of the thing, whatever, society, culture, you feel like an outcast and just used in a sense based on certain things but not really considered. Is that a fair statement?
Ask me again. Let me make sure I heard you correctly.
Do you I'm trying to think. Now I'm trying to think what I asked.
I don't feel outcasted. I don't feel excluded. It's
okay.
It's more of a acknowledgement in the way that we're the way that we're included or excluded. I think that is an area that needs to be improved in some arenas. You know, the way that society views African American men, especially the way that they're depicted in media, the images that come across the news or on TV, that trickles and infiltrates into our communities. It infiltrates into our filters on how we might look at someone walking down the street. Do we lock the doors? Do we lock our car doors? Do we look the other way? Do we not say anything without even knowing who's in front of you? You know, how do we respond to that? I think is the gap.
So have you? So based on your own personal experience in those regards, can you kind of give an example of where you experienced that and it obviously you obviously felt, you know, this person is expecting me to literally like mug them right here, and then can you give an example of where it maybe didn't go and it went the way that you kind of hoped or you expected to go, and what made those experiences different? Or
I haven't had any experiences where somebody thought I was going to mug them.
Okay. I mean, I'm just kind of, but you know what I mean? Like, is that,
right.
I think about a friend of mine who years ago was telling me a story when he grew up. He's Hispanic and he looks like, you know, somebody who would be in a gang, and he used to be, and he told this story, and I remember the emotion he told me about it was just heartbreaking, because he said that this couple was walking down, saw him, and literally crossed the street to walk on the other side of the street because they didn't want to walk by him, and just by the way he looked, right? So that's kind of what if you'd had any kind of experience like that, and if not, if you had somebody that you kind of felt like, for lack of a better way, did it kind of the right way. I don't know if that even makes sense.
One experience comes to mind. It was probably like either Friday or Saturday night. My fiance and I decided to go out and get some ice cream at an ice cream parlor, and we were waiting to be served, and there was an older white woman behind us. She came in with her friend to get some ice cream as well, and she sneezed. I said, "God bless you." She looked me dead in the eye, like I'm looking at you now. Didn't say anything. I thought that she didn't hear me, so I said even louder, "God bless you." We're still looking at each other face to face. I turned to my fiance. I turned to her and I said, "She's not going to say anything." Then my fiance said, "God bless you." She looked at her and didn't say anything. So then I said to myself, "Oh, okay." I said, "You're one of those."
Mm. And by those you mean somebody who just wasn't. I don't know. So what? Yeah. So what is?
So those is someone who's racist.
Okay.
Someone who's bigoted. Someone who doesn't want to acknowledge the humanity. Me being a person trying to bless your well-being and being courteous and polite. She didn't want to acknowledge that at all, as if I didn't exist.
So in moments like that, just as a perspective from a faith standpoint, I mean, do you draw upon your faith to help you get kind of through that moment, or how do you reconcile your faith relative to some of these social issues or experiences?
It takes time. And by me saying, "Oh, you're one of those," that was my faith coming in and saying, I'm able to identify the type of person that you are and where you are in if you have spirituality. That helped me to push back from the natural responses that I would normally have, because I could have went in a different direction and said, "God bless you." "Oh, never mind. Here's some other choice words for you."
Right.
So that comes with time. That comes with being able to have emotional fortitude, to be able to be versed in emotional judo and verbal judo, to recognize the situation, the person that's in front of you, and being able to take the high road, I guess, and let it roll off your shoulder.
So do you ultimately think that that's? I mean, is that
that's not the worst experience I've had, but that's the only one that I can remember. That's the most recent one.
And so as far as the kind of letting it rolling off your shoulder, would you say that there's probably a lot of people today, and I see this at least, who are kind of tired of taking the high road?
Yeah.
And maybe that's kind of a little bit of what is it. Would it be fair to say there's an element of that to what Colin Kaepernick did and people like that? They're kind of like we're fed up and don't really know what else to do relative to this issue, and trying to get that attention around the subject. And I'm not trying to.
I think that's a fair assessment. When you think about Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, these were young, in some cases mentally ill, in some cases poor people of color that had their life taken from them because of the inability for police officers to be able to effectively use their quote-unquote training to manage a situation, to have someone comply. In addition to that, when it goes from bad to worse is when justice comes into, or what we think would be justice, which is in the court of law. When that is applied, it's where it's misapplied at the same time. And I say that because if you shoot someone 19 times and you get off with suspension without pay, that's like a vacation for most people. So, okay, I can take a break from work. Or in Betty Shelby's case. Did I say Betty Ross earlier? I might have said.
No, you didn't. No, but you did say it this time. It's okay. I knew what you meant. Hopefully, you all gave him a little bit of bit of leeway, right? We aren't professionals. We're getting through this, and
so Officer Betty Shelby, she the officer that shot the gentleman in Oklahoma, I believe. She went to court. She said that she was scared for her life, which is, in my view, a learned term by police officers to use when they're facing criminal charges or when they're in court. But that's another topic.
But I think it's important to some context that, I mean, you're saying that, but you've had experience in working in the public sector.
Right.
You're not just a guy watching, television and drawing that conclusion. I mean,
yeah. So from the court case, she is able to keep her job. She ends up getting fired, but then they end up bringing her back to the force. Where's the justice in that? So all these cases, plus the many more that have happened before, the Trayvon Martin case and Mike Brown case, this has been a pattern of behavior. So when this pattern of behavior is applied, there's oppression that exists, and that's what Colin Kaepernick was raising with his protest, was the oppression of African Americans in the hands of police officers.
So to all those cases, because when you say that, I think of each one of them, and as I see them, and see if this is fair. You see them as one continual oppression, kind of the same story over and over again, right?
Over and over again.
But would it be fair to say that fundamentally they're all their own unique situations relative to who acted and how they acted? That the behavior on both sides of the law enforcement officer and on the person who was shot was not fundamentally the same across the board on all of them, and does the history of, does all the other stuff kind of help paint that picture that it's just a continuation? Because at least as I remember, like Michael Brown and specifically Michael Brown, I guess, in terms of the interaction, was not the same as like Philando Castile, to be fair, right? And so what I worry about is that even though, because they're all unique in their own context, right? But if the history is always the cops are getting off, they're literally allowed to go out there and play with people's lives, and to be fair, are they scared for their lives on a daily basis? And because they are, they're almost given this leeway, and so it's just this kind of free for all.
I agree with police officers. We feel the same way as they do. And when I say we, I mean everyone that's not a police officer, not just African Americans. The number one goal for police officers at the end of the day is to what? Is to get home.
Sure.
When I get pulled over by a police officer, the number one goal for me at the end of the day is to get home. Not to get shot, not to get beat up, not to get harassed, but it is to safely make it back to my family.
I mean, I've been pulled over not very often. I'm kind of a dork that way, but I have not been pulled over very often in terms of from law enforcement. But the times that I have, I've never feared for my life.
Why?
It was just never something that ever came out, and I never thought of it as, I mean, worst case scenario, what am I doing? I either maybe rolled a stop sign or I was speeding, right? Or maybe my registration was out. That's pretty much the only thing going on. So okay, you got me doing 75 and a 65 maybe, and for me it's just never been something that I worried about.
So you've never been subjected to pretextual stops?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Pretext stops are a tactic that police officers use to look for additional things besides a maybe not traffic violation. So if you roll the stop sign, that would also give the police officer an ability to look for drugs, say that you look suspicious, be able to search your car in addition to the traffic violation.
Right. Your taillight's out, or your registration's not up to date, or whatever those things happen to be.
Right. You're driving erratically.
Right. And so in that context, I mean, I would imagine that your experience is different in that. Is that fair to say? Or I mean,
I haven't experienced that. No.
And so it's in terms. So you have, as far as what you call it, pretexting, like you have not experienced.
Right. Pretext stops.
Pretext stops. So you haven't. So in your personal experience, have you had? You said you haven't really had a bad or had.
Haven't had a bad experience with getting pulled over. Haven't had experiences with stopped by police officers, walking down the street, but a lot of my friends have. A lot of people in our communities have. Getting, in certain cities they call them stop and frisk. You're walking down the street, might have a grocery bag in your hand. Police officers walking down the street. Let me stop. What are you doing? Where's your identification? Face this wall. So, there's violations and guarantees under the Constitution that are being violated when it comes to that. So there's a bias that exists when police officers are, interacting with our, with communities of color.
So in that context, because okay, so what's part of the rhetoric? I mean, if we're being fair, the part of the rhetoric is, well, if you're not doing anything to begin with,
you have nothing to worry about.
You have nothing to worry about, right?
Right.
And it's that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, where can we come?
And this is the conversations that take place.
Yeah.
They're not they're not conversations that are taking place out of a place of respect, which means that I'm the authority, I'm the law. You're going to comply with me. You're going to answer my questions. I'm just going to be a jerk anyway, regardless of how polite you are to me. And because I was never picked for the kickball team back in middle school, I'm going to take it out on everybody. Some people hide behind the badge. They use their badge as a show of force, and people become victims. So, it's it's very frustrating.
So ultimately, in the shadow of all that, when somebody like Colin Kaepernick goes out and takes a knee, and he's trying to shed another sense of light, another aspect onto this issue going on in those contexts, in terms of how people are treated, how people of color are treated relative to police stops and stop and frisk. Is that what does he ultimately want to happen, or what do you see as potentially happening relative to that we can take from this and, for lack of a better phrase, do something good with it, or walk forward?
Are you asking what can be done?
So in terms of him, like when he does something, when he takes a knee, and he's like,
Kaepernick.
Yeah. So he takes a knee and he says, okay, and he's trying to shed light on these things and saying, look, we need to look more at what happened with Philando Castile. We need to look more at what happened with Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and everyone, and all these other, to your point, continual acts of oppression or of discrimination and law enforcement officers that are acting a certain way. So what is the next step in that process, or the big leap in that process that that can happen? What can happen to make that protest into something that maybe has an impact on those things from before? Is there a possibility with that?
I'm not sure, and that's what I think what we're all waiting for. The conversations are taking place. People of color, everybody is doing their part, because it's not just people of color that are being victims of police brutality. Okay, families are, mothers and fathers are telling their young teens, if you get pulled over by the cop, make sure you do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yes or no. Yes sir. No sir. Yes ma'am. No ma'am. X, Y, and Z. The conversations are taking place, but are they taking place in the police districts? Are the police officers being held accountable? I think it's going to come down to legislation and enforcement.
And I also think it's important to note that these conversations aren't smooth, right? They don't just take off like an airplane and are easy. I think they can almost be a little bit uncomfortable to have, in trying to get to a certain place. Very much trying, today, trying to figure out a way to have this conversation in a sense of being respectful, to be fair on all sides, in a sense. I mean, I struggle personally, to be fair, with the idea, you'd mentioned earlier about, our patriotism going back to Crispus Attucks and looking at all the way through Buffalo Soldiers, 54th Massachusetts in the Civil War.
761st.
Right. All through, right? All these, and so can we, let me just ask a broad question outside of all this. Can we get to a point where the hour is truly our, where it's all of us? It isn't about black or white or yellow or brown, like you said before. And can we get to that point? And then, because I see it as because I don't know what it means to be fair, I don't know what it means to be white. Like, what am I supposed to do, or what I'm responsible for? And maybe there's people out there who are like, oh my gosh, you're a disgrace to your white race. I don't feel like I have a white race. I biologically speaking and scientifically speaking, to get into that tangent, different color skin is a biological thing. It's a result of other things. Different color hair and eyes and stuff like that are just, but their eyes fundamentally, they're just a different color. And so, and to all that, I'm not even sure what makes somebody, quote unquote, white. What are all the rules, and where does it all stop and start? And can we ultimately, and is the goal from the collective to ultimately get to that point where it is more, where it really is an our versus an us and them?
I want to say yes, because I'm optimistic, but I'm also a pessimist sometimes.
Sure.
Honestly speaking, there's 3 systems of racial control that have existed in America: slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. And if you hear those three those three words. That is the result of racism evolving over time. Slavery ends with the passing of the 13th Amendment. It still exists after the Civil War. There was a brief moment of peace. People were scrambling to find out, well, if slavery has been abolished, what are we going to do? We got to fix these loopholes in our system of control. Then comes in Jim Crow, separate but equal. Then comes the Battle of Civil Rights. So the Supreme Court justices, the lawmakers were gaining victories, but also looking at ways to reinvent themselves to keep the system of segregation and racism alive. And it has rolled over into the new form of, in my view, the new form of slavery. After reading Michelle Alexander's book, the new Jim Crow, the mass incarceration, that's what it is, the new form of slavery, because now with the exorbitant amount of African Americans that have been convicted, their rights are being denied under this umbrella of being a felon. They're not able to vote. They're not able to have access to public benefits, education. Trying to find employment is almost impossible. So you are still an outcast of society. You're not able to function. You're not able to be viewed as part of part of society. So what do you become? You become null and void. The other side, as far as being optimistic, it requires one to take a good hard look at themselves. As a Christian, I've always sought to have a wide range of friends. I've always treated everyone the same way. I can look at you. I can look at the wall. I can look at the ceilings. I can look at the door. But the one thing that I can't see is myself. And my grandmother used to say, if you want to know who you are, look at the people that you're surrounded by. Look at your friends, because they're going to be a reflection of you as well. So if I'm, as a Christian, like I say I am, and I'm just like everybody else. And so that doesn't mean that I'm special. I have special powers or anything like that. It's just a lot of prayer. I need it every day. If I'm at church on Sunday and I'm learning to treat your neighbor as you would treat yourself. Love thy neighbor,
Right.
That doesn't just apply to Sunday. It applies to the rest of the week. Okay. So if people are out there wondering, well, I wonder if I'm a racist, or, what are my views? Look at the company that you keep. Look at your children. What are they emulating? What are they seeing from you? What are they seeing from, your family, from your wife, from your neighbors? What are they picking? Because children can be, I think they do a good reflection of of our family sometimes, even though they may not know it. You can tell a lot of what's going on in the family by looking at the children.
Yeah, definitely. And although sometimes, I've known people, as I'm sure you have, who had, this wonderful parents, and then they just chose to not be wonderful people. There's a guy that I'm thinking about that I grew up with who had resources and loving parents and all education, and he decided to identify, for lack of a better word, with the highly conservative, for lack of a better phrase, viewpoint, especially around race and culture and stuff like that. And it almost kind of rejected his upbringing and him and I are no longer friends for that reason, to be fair. But that's one of those where so sometimes I hear what you're saying. I do agree with that to an extent, but I still think it comes down to a person's decision on a personal level. You can, and I've also known people that grew up around a house with parents that were not, that were willing to throw all kinds of bombs out there, and bombs and this bomb and that bomb, and the kids just kind of went, man, I don't buy that.
Right.
And I think part of it,
there's always exceptions. Yeah.
Sure. And I think it's definitely something along the lines of, you kind of have to make that decision for yourself. You kind of alluded to a little bit earlier saying, you need prayer. I need prayer. I need to make sure that I wake up and don't let, the first thought I ever have dominate, right? On any and everything that I ever have, that is my first reaction is to act this way, and slow to anger and all that stuff that we talk about, we hear, and then just just judgment and discrimination, and I think discrimination in a pure sense. We tend to, I think I think there's a natural discretionary aspect to people in terms of what things that we know and don't know, and you kind of alluded to it in terms of who we're used to being around. If you've never sat down and talked to somebody, I mean, look at this. This is having these conversations. And to be fair with you, and I'm sure everybody listening, it's hard in some sense to listen to, because you either want to jump up and say, well, I don't think that way, or not in my experience. But I think this is why we're doing this show.
Oh, absolutely. And to your point, there's what's interesting that I find is when people say, oh, I'm not like that. I'm not racist. In some people's minds, their definition of racism is us still being in shackles and chains and dealing with slavery. That's not racism. I mean, it is, but that's not the racism that exists today. You're not racist, but would you like for a person of color to move in next door to you? Would you like, would it be okay if your son brought home a friend that was of a different race, a different color, or your daughter? How would you feel about that?
Sure.
How intimate are you with inclusion? And this also happens in churches as well. When a person of color will come to a church, sometimes they might be the only person of color there. Then all of a sudden, everyone wants to clamor, come around and embrace him and say, oh, well, how are you? And, what is it like to be, this, that, and the third? We want to get to know who you are. Well, this is a person of color that comes to a church. But how about the church coming to the people of color? Or how about the people that are in the church opening up their doors? Conversations that don't necessarily need to start within the church, need to start with inside the community.
So to that, so we hear the term racism a lot. We hear something happens and the phrase is, oh, that's racist, or that's obviously racism.
Right.
And to your point, I do think it's a word that, and see if you agree with this or not, that I don't want to say it's been overused, because I don't want to negate what it's trying to represent, but it's been used in such a context so many times that I don't know if anybody.
It's a word that we feel.
Good. Okay.
But let's define. Let's actually give the audience a definition of what the word racism is. This is off Google.
There you go.
Look it up. So it has to be right?
I was about to say, it's got to be true if it's on Google, right? That's if it's on the internet, it's true.
Prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior.
Okay.
Second definition. The belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. So I think that's accurate.
So assuming that somebody who's tall, athletic, and is African-American is automatically a basketball player would be a racist statement.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, because not everybody, that's true. Not everybody's a basketball player. Is that right? Okay. And then...
and see, another racist, view would be all Asian Americans know karate.
or they're really smart, or do really well in school and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you're all, yeah, right. Okay, so I think this is a little bit. So I think this is kind of a seminal moment right now. So you said a little bit earlier, and I think it is. I think it's important that we do ask ourselves first, kind of where we are. Are we, instead of it kind of being an outward thing of identifying everybody for their, oh, that was racist, this was racist. To your point, do we have that capacity? Am I? And is it fair to say, and I'd ask yourselves out there, to Jim's point, I don't think very, very few people, I think, and I really, really hope, are not saying, hey, we should put slavery back into session, right? You said that. I think that's true. But to your point as well, is where are the lines, if you will, based on social or cultural or just acceptance in terms of our own lives? Could you bring home? Could you date somebody who looked like this? And I think that's really kind of the crux of it, is asking ourselves around that. Are we really mad at Colin Kaepernick? Are we really mad at some of these people that do things that we don't like because of what they're protesting, or because of, are there other things allowing us to have an emotional reaction to that? And I think that's fair to at least run the gamut. And here's the thing, to all the listeners out there that are here, I think it's okay to ask that question of ourselves. If we're making an honest evaluation of it, right? If we're going to actually ask ourselves honestly, where do we stand in all this, and then at the same time evaluate ourselves, but also letting somebody else have this, let them say something along those lines. Because I do know people, to be fair, that would get kind of upset and get very, very emotional and say, look, I don't care. I don't want that to be an issue. And I keep being told that just by asking a question around something, I am told that I'm a racist. And I'm like, so it kind of, it's a slippery, I think it's a little bit of a slippery slope in that sense.
Here's another word that I think is important to add into the conversation, which is bigotry. And this is, again, Google definition: intolerance toward those who hold different opinions from oneself.
See, that to me
So
seems a lot. That seems to me very appropriate in a lot of ways, of just not willing to listen. Because something like this, I mean, to be fair, there's a good chance that there's
a large audience around that word.
Sure.
That I think kind of fuels the whole Colin Kaepernick debate.
Okay. So someone's a bigot. So let's start there. Let's say that I'm sitting here saying that I fall within the context of that word. What is the next step? What are the possible steps, or what can we do? Because I to me, physical violence isn't going to eradicate it. Isn't going to cause it to go away. I understand the proclivity to do that. I understand the frustration around that. I understand why people would want to react that way. And there's some people that would lobby and say, no, Sean, if somebody says something really stupid and I, haul off and whack them right, and give them a good whooping, they're going to change their mind. I don't know if that's true. It's kind of like, I don't know if you saw made me think of the story of the Antifa group out there. I think it was in Seattle, that there was a guy walking around with a swastika on his arm, or he was on one of the subways, and they put out the little thing to everybody, and somebody found the guy at a stop, and they filmed him, and somebody just walked up and literally knocked the guy unconscious, just knocked him out cold for wearing a swastika. Now, I personally am not going to feel a lot of sympathy for that guy for doing that, for wearing that swastika and getting knocked out for it. I'm not saying that I lost a lot of sleep, but my worry fundamentally was, is that guy going to get up and take that swastika off and think about what he's doing? Or is it going to reinforce his ideals, whatever those ideals may be? And that, to me, that's kind of where the struggle is. I understand the need to want to, I have that propensity in me to see somebody treating somebody a certain way, especially around something like this. I mean, just being a bigot for the sake of it, or just being, truly being a racist and being that way. I think that's the fallen nature. I want to react in a physical way to keep that from happening. But I don't know if that's going to solve the problem.
Violence is not going to solve the problem. what causes alarm for me is just the climate of normalcy that exists currently in our country. Last week, or if not the week before, the president was honoring the Native Americans, that the code talkers.
Navajo code talkers from World War II. Yeah.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Had a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the back. The
president known for killing Native Americans.
Trail of Tears.
Right.
Didn't have the wherewithal or the consciousness to realize his audience. And then on top of that, adds insult to injury by referring to them as, what's the name of American? Oh, gosh. Was it Sacagawea? No.
I thought he referred to, that was about Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren.
Right. Called her
Pocahontas.
Pocahontas.
Right.
So one of those, it was a slur that's not favored upon by the Native American community. So, I say all that because there's this rising intolerance or indifference that exists. And what happens is that there's a resistance to that's seeking to make that not the case, because there's too many instances where vitriolic public pronouncements are flying across social media and from all avenues, all aspects. If it's not people in office, it's people on the local level, our elected leaders, or people that are that have that hold high positions, and it's just carrying on as if we're that other people are just secondary. And is this going to be the new norm living in America?
Well, I think to your point, you said that this actually is, it's not the new norm. It's the norm that we've been around, right? I mean, people making prejudicial statements or stereotypical statements or anything like that.
And then retract, oh, I'm sorry. Are you really sorry? No.
Well, so here's where I would suggest, to be fair, is I'm not waiting for President Trump. And literally and figuratively, I'm not waiting for him to make this better. And I would encourage everybody out there not to wait for him. Not because I don't think he's capable. That's a whole other story. But I think it starts with all of us sitting down, literally having a conversation, albeit even if it's a difficult one. And look, Jim and I are friends. I respect him. This has been a tough conversation, right? This has been in trying to figure out which way to go and how to interpret and how to be both respectful of what is said and how to be appreciative of what is said, not only from your viewpoint, but kind of what it ultimately means. And I think if we don't allow each other to, or not even each other, but even just listening to the other side, for lack of a better word, letting somebody speak about their experiences, and then let's all take a deep breath and take a moment, just instead of wanting to react. And if I did that, I apologize. This is episode 1. We're going to get there. But if the idea is just to listen and try to contemplate for a moment the other side and their in a viewpoint that they have, because I will say that one of the things that I think that's kind of I don't want to say fear, but I think the concern for if I can be generic and loop everybody in from this side of the table. There's a lot of people like, look, I'm not a racist. I don't agree with all this stuff. I don't even want it to be a big deal. I don't like it when watching the tape for Philando Castile getting shot and then reading the tapes and listening to what was happening and listening. This guy's seemed to me like the police officer was absolutely scared out of his mind in terms of what he was doing, and he allowed his fear to end the life of a human being, and that in front of his daughter and his girl. I mean, that's a horrible thing. I think no matter what color anybody is, that happens, that's a horrible thing. This guy lost his life in a split decision, in a moment of fear, and I don't know. And maybe you can correct me. Maybe I didn't. Is it fear because he? I just don't feel like it was. I don't think he. Or some of these even are just like this effort. Like, okay, we have to go and commit this crime for some other greater purpose, like to keep that oppression there. You know, is that, I don't, you know what I'm saying?
So, so let me ask you this. What, when you see the march in Charlottesville take place, when you see the alt-right have marches and, you know, make these, have these events of these displays of European power and things along the line, how do you feel?
Well, so for me personally, looking at the Nazi flag and the Confederate flag, I mean, I'm a World War II buff, and to be fair, if you look at the history of the Nazi Party, which was a political party, to be fair, National Socialism that was started and became very popular in the context that it was used there, in the context that we see it now, when Hitler rose to power in Germany, and what he did during World War II, which included, you know, this idea of this pure race and just this you know, Aryan nation that he wanted to go back and recreate in terms of that. On a personal level, there are a few things that get me as emotionally fired up and frustrated, and to be fair, on some level angry, than this, because that led to things like the extermination of the Jews. That led to efforts by through the Nazi Party in control of Germany at the time, the mass eradication of children that were born with defects, that were, you know, gypsies, that were homosexuals. There was a true movement internal. I read a book years ago called The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton about the psychology of genocide and what they were trying to accomplish, and how that's really what they're, and that final solution was this idea that if they could eradicate Judaism and Jews, it would kind of literally, like, and there was a quote that a doctor gave in terms of how he looked at the Jewish population as a, quote, gangrenous appendage that needed to be removed. And if they could just eradicate that out of the body, everything would be fine. So that's what I see when I see that. I also see a bunch of people who have this idea around, you know, this white supremacy, that have this idea behind this pure white race, and this high, and there's an allure and a love for the Confederacy and the way things were way back in the day, for lack of a better phrase, before all the civil rights, before even Jim Crow, even before the 13th Amendment, like back in this, before this, during and before the Civil War.
Right. Absolutely.
That's what I see.
Right. And that's how we see what in some eyes, what great America, you know, make America great, what make America great again means.
Sure. But to be fair, at the same time, I see a very small group of people that feel that way.
It might be larger than you think, though.
From
my view,
so it's
the Jim Crow had granddaughters and grandsons. The KKK got rid of their hoods, and they are now in the police force. They're in the judge seats. They're, you know, the circuit judges. Anything where there's, you know, they're the ones. Well, not they're the ones, but they're in positions to where their agenda is still being applied, and it's being carried out through the eradication of killing people of color, you know, whichever way that they can. You may not see them marching, you may not see them, you know, wearing the swastika, but it is there. It's concealed.
So at the same time, okay, and here's the thing. I to be fair, I can't say either way. Like, that's not true. That is true, or whatnot. You kind of asked what I saw.
Right.
What I also saw and what I also see is on the opposing side are people of the same, for argument's sake, color, nationality, race, whatever you want to call it, of the people on the other side fighting and arguing against it and saying,
right.
And if you look back at during the civil rights movement in terms of people that were marching and people that were involved and people.
Right. It was some powerful people, great people that gave their lives
right.
that were Caucasian.
Right. So it's kind of that it's kind of that paradox that I don't see any appeal on a personal level for that level of passion in terms of what we ultimately want from their side. And I say the we in terms of them saying we want. I'm not even sure what they want other than just this white power and white pride and whatever else. And as I see it, and maybe, and this is just to be fair to the conversation, and a part of that I think was around the idea they wanted to get rid of that. I think it was a General Lee statue, and they were going to take the statue down, and they were basically protesting this because there's this, to your point, kind of mentioned Andrew Jackson, but on a lesser degree, when you have statues that are erected for Confederate soldiers and generals and such, as an homage to that, there's definitely a movement in the temperance saying, why do we have that up when that's what that represented, and it was such a big part of this entire process, right? And to your point, it kind of shows that continuation. Well, you're telling me that it doesn't exist, and I look over here and see a General Lee or a Stonewall Jackson or a Nathan Bedford Forrest statue over here. You're telling me it doesn't still exist, and yet right here in the middle of the city park in 2017 is this statue representing a guy who stood for that 100%.
Absolutely.
Right. So, and then when people try to take it down, then these radical groups kind of get up and say, well, we're not going to let you because this is heritage and history. And
case in point, this came up as I'm hearing you speak about history. So when I was in Savannah a while back, I went there for a few days to visit. I was coming out of a store, walking to my car. The car was, I had street parking. The car was parked at a traffic light. As I was getting into my car, there was a tour bus that came by. So the tour was based on old Savannah. As we know, Savannah was a slave port. So I'm putting my things in my car, and all I hear was, if you were a slave owner, you would do this. If you were a slave owner, you would have your cotton exported to the port, right? A few blocks down the street. If all I heard was slave, plantation owner, slave, and plantation owner.
This is an audible, like a tour, like a tour bus, or something?
It was a tour bus.
Yeah.
It was a tour bus, and the moderator, the tour guide, was given
a historical perspective.
Right. And
here's where they were. Yeah.
So I caught a glance of people on the bus. They were looking at me. I'm looking at them. It was an awkward moment, but that moment, I just felt, my adrenaline was going, because this narrative is still being promoted or glorified. And I understand the historical context of it, but does it need to be championed in the way that it was in 2017? There can be some references, but do we need to hear songs going down the street, with singing the old, battle hymn of the Republic, or something along that line.
Look away.
Right. Right. So, that kind of came to mind when you were talking about statues and history.
No, and I'm a history buff, and I appreciate the history side of it.
Did you pick up the new book that came out called Grant?
There's a new Grant book now, huh?
Yeah, it just came out.
No,
I picked it up. Looking forward to reading it.
He's an interesting fellow. You talk about, that Appomattox courthouse when him and General Lee got together, and literally two worlds colliding, but that's a whole other story.
There's another book out called The Neo-Confederate Reader by James Lowen, and it goes into the Confederate flag and how Robert E. Lee, after the battle was lost, made a declaration that anyone who was still honoring the flag, it was a form of treason.
It's a point of contention to be safe, and I'll tell you one story without trying to say too much about my thought on it. There was a guy when I was in the Navy years ago, and he was from Washington State, and I remember he was running around with a Confederate flag on, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, which side of the Civil War did Washington State fight on?" And he kind of looked at me really funny, and I went, "Yeah, I mean, was it the North or the South that Washington State fought on?" And it took him a little while. And he actually came back to me later, and he was like, "Yeah, Washington wasn't even a state during the Civil War." And I kind of was like, "Well, yep." It kind of like so I think there's some romanticism around it. To be fair, and look, this may be here's episode 1, and we may just absolutely divide and conquer a lot of people with this, or I may do in relative to the podcast. But to your point, the Confederate flag was the flag of the Confederate States that seceded from the Union and fought against the Union,
right,
for their own sake. And there was a point in time where our country was fighting against that. And I don't. You can kind of take that however you want, and I think it's look. In loss of life was huge on both sides, and people died, and it was awful. It was a grotesque war. If you go back and study it in terms of the amount of just human carnage that died on a constant basis. I understand the need and the desire, to be fair, to unify kind of post-war in terms of how do we reconcile this. I don't know if I'm just all over the place with this because I'm not trying to make an excuse for it either way.
So let me ask you this: so why is there this push to relive those times, to go back to that way of life?
I think people become, there's a nostalgia. Make America Great Again. There's this nostalgia with the past as if it was so much better than the present, right? I think that's a natural inclination. We look at if only we could go back. And one of the things, so I will say this: what does frustrate me is when people do say they want to go back into the past to 1965. You want to go back to that? You want to go back to 1950 or 1940? I mean, is that really where you want to go back to that period or 100 years ago?
Right.
And truly look at what it was like in that time period.
Because it wasn't great for
any of
us, right?
When you have just literally legal separation of people based on gender or on perceived race and differences, and I think there's a positive in being progressive and whether it's medical technology or anything else that comes along that makes our life easier. Not that I'm lazy, but I think there's some benefit to that. But to the idea that we want to go back to it, I think that's, for whatever reason, we kind of find this nostalgia around that we could just go back to the way it was because it really is terrible right now. But it just seems like that's the argument all the time. And 50 years ago, they're saying the same. We got to go back to where it was. And I don't know if we're completely off the subject here because we go. But these are all parts of. This is why this conversation have to happen. It's important to understand. So kind of come back to center a little bit to your original question about the Confederate flag, or around the Confederate flag and how that works. I think we do ourselves a disservice by honoring it to that high degree and bringing it and allowing it to fly equal, especially with either state flags or national flags. I think there's a possibility for an opportunity for reconciliation, or at least a step in that direction, by recognizing, sure, the historical side of it in terms of this is what the flag was of the Confederacy when it was way back in the 1860s during the war. Mm-hmm. But as far as flying that flag now, I would ask this. Let me put it this way, because there are probably people that are ready to just have all kinds of emotions. Let me say this, and you kind of alluded to it earlier. What is the indication if you're flying the Confederate flag today? What do you mean by it? What do you want it to represent? It's going to represent something. That's what a flag does.
Right.
When I see the flag of Texas, it means something to me. When I see the flag of the United States, it means something to me. It represents something. What is the flag? What does the Confederate flag mean to you, and why are you flying it? Truly, why are you flying it? Ask yourself that question. What message are you portraying to the world by putting it up there? And I think that's a fair question. So if anything else comes from this podcast, if you're still sticking around, we're an hour and 33 minutes in. We're down the way here.
We're just getting started.
We're just getting started. No, and that's the thing. So what do you want? What does that flag mean to you? And then I'll ask you to take it a step further. What do you think that flag means to somebody else? I know what I can think of it. I mean, I know my feelings on it, but I look at you and I think I should ask you that question. What do you think it means to you? And allow that conversation to happen.
To me, the flag symbolizes a period of time that continues to live in the minds of many African Americans, where our lives were upended. They were separated. Our identity was stolen through slavery. We were not considered equal. We were murdered. We were beaten up. Our children were taken from us. Our women were raped. It is a symbol of hatred as well as separation. And it's kind of hard to have a family that has a lineage and a history that involves their ancestors being slaves to stand up and salute America when America hasn't been the America that has been for everybody else.
So I think it's important right now, relative to that statement, to just let that statement be, and to listen to that, and to not. And I mean this on my sense, not only from a timing standpoint, but I think from a poignant standpoint of letting that statement from Jim resonate and be what it is, and contemplate on it. And it's not a matter of, I don't think it's fair to do a matter of right or wrong. I don't want to say that incorrectly. That is an accurate representation of what that means to him. And if that means something to you, take it and digest it first before you decide to come at it or to try to dismiss it or to try to say that it's not right. That is part of the issues I think we have out there, folks. If I'm being fair, if you made it this far and you're still listening and you've gone past all this stuff and you're staying with us in the ebb and flow of this conversation, first and foremost, I want to thank you for sticking around. But more than anything, I want to ask you to truly take a step back and try not to come up with a reason why Jim is wrong, and try to come up with an idea of just respecting what Jim feels about the subject, and give him that, and and then ask yourself what you can do about it relative to that. And maybe that's the wrong thing to say too, because you hear that and people are like, well, I didn't do anything. I wasn't a slave owner. I didn't cause that. Okay. But those are the feelings that are out there. Those are the emotions people are battling on both sides. But let's let this happen, and let's let this stand out there for a little bit. Jim, we got to wrap up.
Oh, wow.
But there's always the next chapter in the book.
Okay.
And look, this was a great first episode, to be fair with you. And I think
I enjoyed it.
I did. I think it allowed us to kind of see really what's out there, what the challenges are, what the real crux of this is. It's not an easy subject, especially this one. There's so many aspects to it, and there's so many things around it. I just appreciate your willingness to come on and just talk about it. I thank you for coming to the table and coming.
Anytime.
And I appreciate your viewpoint. One of the things we want to do here at the podcast as we end is, no matter who it is that we're talking to, we want to end it with just a moment of prayer. And I'm going to ask you if you'd pray with me. Heavenly Father, we come to you just humbled and grateful for this opportunity to get together and just have a conversation. And hopefully we did you service by glorifying you and using love as part of this, and coming to this table with love in our hearts and love in our intentions. And I just thank you for Jim and his openness and willingness to come to this actual table as well. I hope that this comes out there. I hope that it reaches, even if it's just one person that's out there that says, give me an opportunity to just take a step back and rethink what I'm thinking. Or can we have a conversation as well around this with somebody that they know? Can this bear fruit out there in the world? Can this opportunity be taken to glorify you and give them the chance to do this? And can we retrospect on this? Because it's important, Lord. It's important because this is something that is dividing us. It's causing people to separate from each other. And we are so much better together than apart. And I ask that you just give people the strength and wisdom and the patience and the endurance on both sides to believe in something greater than the moment and what's causing us this strife. Thank you so much for our health. Thank you for Jim again. We love you, Lord, and it's your son's name that we pray. All right, buddy.
All right.
That'll do it. Episode 1 of the books.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
This was great.
No problem. Appreciate it. Hope you liked it. Love to hear some feedback. Love to hear from anyone. It's the email address is the come to the table podcast @gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. We have a Twitter. Any kind of feedback we can get, we would love to hear about. Thank you, and we're looking forward to next week's episode. And as always, God bless.
Thank you so much for listening to the Come to the Table podcast. As always, we hope our conversations inspire you to invite someone you know and love to the table to have an open, loving, and respectful discussion, maybe even a difficult one. If that happens, we'd be honored if you would contact us about it so we could share it. Thanks again.
And God bless everyone.